I think we're going to move on and get started with Don and John. They are doing a tag team talk about improving the odds of success with manure and high-priced fertilizer applications. So John is the crop nutrition specialist for Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. Previously, John was an extension and field crop researcher with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Currently, John is the chair of the Manitoba Soil Fertility Advisory Committee. And John is a certified crop advisor and was recognized by the American Society of Agronomy as the International CCC of the Year in 2014. And Don Flaten is recently retired from the University of Manitoba, where he was a professor in soil fertility, crop nutrition, and nutrient management. Prior to teaching and conducting research on a full-time basis in the Department of Soil Science, Don was director of the School of Agriculture at the University of Manitoba, as well as a provincial soil specialist for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture and a district agriculturalist for Alberta Agriculture. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and Don. Again, just reminding anybody, if they have questions, you can throw them up in the chat as we go along, or you can save them for the end and you can ask them live.
Thank you, Amy. Do you have my screen up there?
Yeah, sorry, John. I can see your presentation perfectly.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that introduction. And I think this is great. I love doing these with Don, so I'm glad that you allowed us to tag team this. And following on that, Don and I are tag teaming. I'm going to cover the fertilizer portion, and Don's going to deal with the manure portion and maybe complement some of Joanne's observations from her studies. So what we're going to focus on, one of the themes we've done in the past is looking at fertilization being risky business. And so we're looking at improving odds of success with manure and high-priced fertilizer applications. Again, I'm still gainfully employed, but Don's a pensioner with the University of Manitoba, and glad to have him out of retirement today. So key things that are driving things, why farmers want to be in the fertilization game, is that we can see here crop prices have risen dramatically. I'm going to try and see if my pointer will let me go here. And in just the past year, we've seen, in this case, some very high prices. This graph put together looking at milling wheat, but it doesn't matter the crop. It could be canola, soybeans, corn. They've all seen this large run up in price, meaning that there is, for farmers, there's a reward for producing high yields at high price, high value crops. And so there's an opportunity cost should we accidentally under fertilize the crop. So that's why farmers want to ante up and get in the game and take advantage of some of these higher crop values that are out there. At the same time, we see here simultaneously, here's some data from Alberta Agriculture puts together that allows us to look at fertilizer prices. And close to a mirror image, one might say that fertilizer prices have risen dramatically. It increases the cost of fertilization and the risks of over-fertilization, in that over-fertilizing now costs you much more money than it would have previously. So we've seen these almost mirror images of run-ups, not just crop demand running up fertilizer prices, but several of these supply chain, tariff, if we go overseas, some vindictive measures, but nevertheless, there are world factors driving up the prices of fertilizers. And in Western Canada this summer, we experienced a drought across much of the prairies, and in fact, dry conditions remain. And in this environment where we're very dependent on stored soil moisture, if we have low reserves, the additional risk is that we may not have high yield potential next year. Although we'd like high yield potential and we'd like to fertilize for it, we know that soil reserves are low in areas. So we're moving to what's called a high stakes poker table. It takes more to get in the table with high price fertilizer, but the rewards are potentially high. So to look at the improving odds of success, we're going to look at nutrient stewardship, the 4R nutrient stewardship framework. And it's an approach used by industry, government, farmers to achieve responsible nutrient use through the 4Rs, the right source, right rate, right time, and right place. And I'll focus on the fertilizer management, and Don will close with some manure stories. So starting off here, this card game, this is the one I'm holding up my sleeve. The ace is the soil test, but there are other things, particularly in regards to nitrogen. We look at nitrogen credits. We can look at varying crop needs, crop yield goals. We look at the economics, nitrogen cost and the price, and what we used to call crop husbandry, we now refer to as agronomy. All those are things that are going to be strategic in determining the rate. First is the soil test, and out here in the West, where we freeze tight for the winter, the fall soil test is a very good measure or indication for us of available nitrogen the following year. And we can see that every time we experience a drought, we go back here to some of the droughts in the late 80s, it leaves us with high levels of residual nitrogen. The only thing that comes close to that is some of the values from this year, where we may traditionally have an average of 20 to 30 pounds residual nitrogen. We're in some cases much more than that this year. This is AgVise Laboratories that functions in the upper northern Great Plains. This is their territory. Let's zero in on some Manitoba geography. This is the residual nitrate levels in the 2-foot sample following wheat. And we can see some areas of Manitoba, not surprisingly, where the drought was most severe, with some very high median nitrogen levels. Median means half the samples came in above this number, half the samples came in below this number. So we can see some very high levels, particularly in eastern Manitoba, but again, higher than normal levels in the West. And to zero in a little further, looking at how they've displayed a chart, those distribution of samples with more than 100 pounds per acre nitrate in the top 2 feet, we could see that in this area, the South Interlake region, almost half of the samples there would have more than that. So there are indeed, with soil testing, growers will find some fields that require very little additional nitrogen fertilizer, which in years like this could be great savings. Unfortunately, it comes at a cost. If you're getting high carryover, it means that last year's crop probably yielded quite low. So the other fertility credits here, I just wanted to run through them. Don's going to talk the manure hand, but for forage legumes, we use a book value of a 90-pound nitrogen credit that we start with, and then we subtract from that, depending on how thin the legume stand is. And if termination is delayed from midsummer onwards, that credit is reduced. For post crops, we offer no credit for soybeans. We continue to do research and show that soybeans are a pig for nitrogen. They take it away, but they don't leave very much. So a 0 credit for soybeans. We do see some credit for peas. Traditionally, though, we have considered that or tapped into that as the pulse yield bonus. If you're tight for nitrogen dollars this year, you may decide to capitalize on some of that nitrogen. Historically, we've not done that. Green manure crops are not very common here, but they are used by some organic reduced fertilization growers. And if their thumb rule is for every 1,000 pounds of dry matter, they may have 15 pounds of nitrogen available for next year's crop. Cover crops, big question mark there. We know they reduce soil nitrogen in the fall. They take up nitrogen. Studies out here and in the upper Midwest just showing that they're not very good at giving it back. And in fact, sometimes we experience yield drag. So still question mark on how we're going to get cover crops to perform. A soil organic matter credit? No. Dawn has done several studies on this, and the mineralization from organic matter is, of course, very dependent on knowledge of in-season moisture. We don't know what that's necessarily going to be, and I'll show some examples later. The other thing that folks that like to give organic matter credits usually forget to give the immobilization penalty. And in studies here with wheat and things like this, we find that 30-pound nitrogen credit is easily taken away with a 30-pound immobilization deficit. We don't confuse growers talking about these since they're so similar. No credit. Just a picture here of our 2021 drought. And when we did get some rain in late August, we had some tremendous regrowth. And that regrowth tapped into leftover soil nitrate. And for example, this oat field on the left here, I did clippings and in a ton of dry matter, there was 80 pounds of nitrogen. In some of this canola to the right, that was canola that was deemed a 2 to 4 bushel per acre crop and written off by crop insurance. Later with some rain, Frankenstein came back to life and was produced as biomass with tremendous nitrogen uptake. Big question. We're not going to get all that nitrogen back in next year's crop. It just does not seem to be released very much. And so it kind of falls into the cover crop category as a question mark. Looking at how crops differ in their response to nitrogen, and here, I didn't know this, I guess I don't gamble enough. The green chips are the most expensive ones and are high nitrogen use crops, corn, canola, spring and spring wheat and winter cereals. Some of our more modest users of nitrogen are oats and flax. Low response, or where we tend not to use much, would be soybeans or peas. Dry beans are a question mark. Historically, we've had some pretty aggressive recommendations for nitrogen on dry beans, but we do have some current research revisiting that. Again, although we do get some response to it, it is something where people may look at the chance to reduce rates. Just a note about phosphorus and potassium needs. Have to watch that someone's not dealing from the bottom of the deck here, and soybeans tend to be that crop. They do not respond to phosphorus in studies that Don Flaten and students have run in Manitoba, numerous phosphorus and potassium studies, not responding to fertilizer. They just do an excellent job of robbing from the bank and reducing soil reserves. So we may get away with some lower rates on soybeans this year, as long as we have the discipline to make that up with better priced fertilizer in the future. And then the low users, for example, flax, does not respond a lot to nutrients like phosphorus. And anytime we have to seed crops later in the season into warm soils, our response or benefit to phosphorus is reduced. So we know that aspect of production can affect the need. I've put up here just to illustrate some of the crops and their response to nitrogen, some of our stylized curves that I've drawn from some Manitoba data sets. And looking at the quadratic curve here, it allows us to do some calculation of most economic rates. Although our data does not always fit this curve very well, we're using it in this instance. So with corn, and I should say on the up-down axis is the yield in bushels per acre. The bottom axis is nitrogen supply. The soil, that 2-foot soil test, plus the nitrogen fertilizer applied. So it's including whatever we know as far as an available nitrogen supply. Those crops tend to come in with a demand need of between 150 to 200 pounds of total supply. Interestingly, with that curve on the corn, if corn was $5, if we went a year ago to what corn prices and fertilizer prices it would be suggesting 190 pounds of nitrogen per acre for every 10 cents per pound, nitrogen goes up, that optimum rate declines about 10 pounds per acre. But if fertilizer price or if crop prices have stayed up, it tends to counterbalance that decline. If you look at the other crops here, we have barley and wheat, and those tend to be responding to things in the order 110 to 120 or 150 pounds of nitrogen. And then a low need crop like oats. And for that, the work done, gosh, a quarter century ago now, the work tend to show that the optimum nitrogen rate was just about 100 pounds of total N supply per acre. So we have some of these response curves that we can use in some decision making. Here we're just looking at which tend to be the heavy feeders. Interestingly, out here on the prairies, we need to acknowledge that the nitrogen needs differ based on moisture. Under dry conditions, we have reduced yield potential, but more nitrogen may actually be needed. That's because we have reduced nitrogen efficiency under dry conditions. We've got less mineralization, less mass flow to the roots. And so I'm going to show some response curves here that are interesting because they're developed under some different moisture regimes. This one here is our spring wheat response to nitrogen under a moist environment. So kind of a classic yield response curve. And that one was developed from 18 sites in Manitoba, Saskatchewan area. Oh. If we look at the dry environment, this was some, ahead of myself here. This was from some 67 sites. We can see that the yield is less because it's drier, but if we're looking at nitrogen efficiency, we see that we achieve 40 bushels per acre with less than 50 pounds of nitrogen under a moist regime, where it takes at least 2 times that amount of nitrogen under the dry regime to get that type of yield. So in essence, it looks like moisture, in-season moisture or moist conditions are a replacement for nitrogen. If we look at a environment, 55 sites actually under arid or droughty conditions, we see that yield is capped at a low level, and we just get no longer response to nitrogen. And in fact, in the droughty areas in Manitoba this year, 31 to 33 bushels per acre of wheat was the norm. And so whatever nitrogen had been supplied in excess to that, that's what's been ending up as our nitrate soil reserves. Our corn yield responses show something similar. Both Don and I have had a kick at the can here. I ran 10 studies in 2016 to 2017. What we're referring to here is some moist years. Not necessarily a lot of in-season rainfall, but one of those years had low rainfall, but full soil reserves. And we could see under the higher yield group that we produced, the axis was 150 bushels per acre with seemingly no nitrogen here. That's maybe taking into account the large amount of mineralization you might expect. If we go to, then once Don and student Lanny got in the game, they end up some dry year environments. And so to compare their green line to my blue one up there, you can see that the zero nitrogen, the check yield is about half that. That mineralization given the year with some good, not excessive, but some good in-season moisture goes a long way to supplying nitrogen needs of the crop. Their yields were less. Their response to applied nitrogen was actually a bit higher than this somewhat flat curve, but high yielding curve I experienced. So we've harnessed over 10 years ago, fertilizer prices ran up in the 2008, and ourselves, like most US states and others, developed a tool for growers to assess what's the economically optimum rate. And this is our tool. This is our nitrogen rate calculator. And it will, based on yield data sets we had for spring wheat, barley, and canola, growers have this option where we would put in values of estimated crop price, fertilizer price, and the soil test nitrogen. In this case, we're looking at a crop of hybrid canola. And within the chart here, the blue cells are the ones where the maximum return is achieved. So that would be right up until where $1 of crop is returning $1, the same dollar you're spending on nitrogen. I actually like to look at that range. The orange bars on the outside of that are within a $1 per acre of the optimum range. And that actually suggests, you've got about a 40-pound of nitrogen window to hit the very similar economic spot. So as we could see here with this example, as urea price goes up for every 100 pounds per ton at the top there, at the expensive rate, it does ratchet back the applied nitrogen rate. And as nitrogen becomes less expensive, it increases the rate of nitrogen to, again, squeeze out more bushels. Don actually worked out some scenarios here about how this calculator could be used. The top example here, and this is looking at 30 pounds residual nitrogen. But if we look at a modest fertilizer cost and a modest crop value, such as perhaps a year ago, we could see that the model would suggest the optimum N rate's 115 pounds of nitrogen, and we're achieving near full yields with that yield curve. If we went to a situation looking at high fertilizer and high crop price, well, we're back to almost very similar nitrogen rate, very similar yield being achieved. If for reason we would have high fertilizer price, but modest crop prices, last year's crop prices, well, it does ratchet back somewhat, and we do leave some yield on the table in order to optimize return. If we look at what happens if we fertilize that way and have modest prices, but it is dry again. So yield potential is limited. And there we're looking at only 25 pounds of nitrogen required for optimum. But again, the lid on production is set by water, and it's about 31 bushels the acre. This is how people can use this type of a tool. Below is a similar case with canola. I just mentioned that with canola, when canola prices are high, it tends to force some very high nitrogen rates in order to squeeze out those last few bushels. So we see that here. Our model tops out at about 52 bushels the acre. So we fertilize for almost full yield when we're at modest fertilizer and modest crop prices, similar high fertilizer, high crop prices. And we do ratchet back somewhat when high fertilizer prices, modest crop prices. It does reduce the nitrogen rate, but only really tinkers with the crop yield. Next card, the last one I think we're playing here on nitrogen is agronomy and nitrogen rates. And we know that it could be impacted based on the rotation that you're following in your fields. That can have impact. Something else, seeding dates, we get better nitrogen response to early seeded crops. If you're seeding late, you could probably reduce your nitrogen, your yield potential's down, your response to nitrogen's down. For variety selection, I should mention there that we've had variety improvement with some not necessarily difference in yield response, but yield level. And if we go to those previous wheat yield curves, actually Amy Maget, our host here, and Don Flaten did work with improved varieties and found not good curvilinear response when we put the data together, but the same relationship as the other one at optimum yield potential it was taking about 2.3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel in that yield curve. And that's a similar relationship that you found with your much higher yielding varieties. And weed control, especially early weed control, is very important for nitrogen efficiency, particularly in corn. Some great work out of Wisconsin. Spray early and spray often and keep fields weed free, and it'll substitute for nitrogen. Crops respond to phosphorus. Just putting this in here, just a reminder that the phosphorus soil test is very important. We use this classic research from Saskatchewan for many lessons, but the case here is to look at that blue line on the bottom is indicative of a low phosphorus soil test. The two green lines above it had received batch applications of phosphorus earlier and built up to a somewhat higher level. So we're looking at what's the importance of keeping my fertilizer rates high in a year like this. And we can see that if we're on low testing fields, yes, to get what yield potential is there, I generally need to maintain fertilizer rates according to the soil test recommendations, so close to the max here. Whereas where I have built up soil tests and they are operating in the medium or high range, I may be able to apply quite a bit less than removal amount, starter rates, and still get good yield levels, knowing full well that I'm exploiting or drawing down soil reserves. And so we expect that many farmers have been asking this question. Those that have been undertaking a program to replenish depleted soil reserves may have this card to play also, that they can back off on their replenished fields, but on depleted fields, they'll probably have to keep their rates close to normal levels. The other aspect of the efficiency gain is if we look at the source and where enhanced efficiency fertilizers come in or cost. The other is timing, looking at fall, at seeding applications or in-crop splits. And the other one is placement or banding. Now, for those of you in the West, this was like the tablet Moses carried down from the mountains. We know that the place for nitrogen fertilizer ideally is in the band. And let me run through the reasons. We eliminate surface runoff. A band application slows nitrification, which would reduce leaching and denitrification loss. It eliminates volatilization if we've replaced it there. It reduces immobilization with straw, and it advantages the crop over weeds by placing it in a band. So we know historically why banding was a preferred way. People always ask me, what's changed now that we have these other options, enhanced efficiency fertilizers, etc.? Is banding still required or important? So inquiring minds need to know, so I'm going to show you recent studies. And these are done at IHARF. Chris Holzaffel, our good friend over there, has been laboring away, and he has been doing 4R nitrogen management studies the last 4 or 5 years, evaluating multiple types of placement, source, and timing. And I encourage you to look at one of his more recent updates here. And in order to put them together in a table, I've taken the liberty of indexing to the yields to what he's considered the gold standard, or is at seeding side-banded urea. And I'll work through just a couple illustrations here. So this is the 2 years he did this with canola, and looking at, again, the first one is side-banded urea at 100%. I have the sources listed at the bottom: green for urea and white for urea, green for agrotane treated urea, blue for super U, yellow for ESN, and in the spring it included a UAN solution dribbled. So looking at these, if we look at the fall broadcast, Doesn't matter what type of additives, it's not coming close within to the spring applied side band. And in fact, the spring broadcast nitrogen is really not performing that well either. And so we have a case where that's like that. But if I compare the fall banded, in soil banded, that's the time that we close that gap, or we seem to have similar efficiency on that. Okay. And the spring split did not perform all that well. I'll mention something more about that later here. Now, the wheat response to nitrogen placement, that's 4 years, and he has others on the way looking at this. Again, same color coding on the bottom. Compared to the spring banded, the fall broadcast again did not perform that well, although it looks like Agrotane may have helped close that gap a bit. Fall banded performed very well. In fact, the single year when ESN was applied, it did extremely well in that case. So fall banding still performing well, and spring broadcasting still not meeting the yields that we were achieving there, nor the spring split. That was with the portion put on before seeding and the rest put on following in crop. Now, this is in contrast to the research that Don and Amy completed just a couple years ago. In Amy's research found actually superior yield and protein with that split. But Amy also had, I believe you had rain within 5 days of your application. And I think that's the real secret and the risk in this type of system is you need rainfall to incorporate that in-season nitrogen. Just another note here looking at with wheat, we use protein as a measure of nitrogen efficiency also. And again, we see that that fall broadcast is just not meeting the standard of the side band. Fall banding looking okay. So just a summary here of some recent research that the consistent winners are still banding at seeding, and the fall application performed very well also. Consistent losers would broadcast, whether it was fall or even spring, performed poorly in these studies. And occasional winners, well, we do see occasionally the enhanced efficiency fertilizers improved that performance. And I guess the hope was it would improve performance of broadcasting, but not quite up to snuff yet with compared to banding. Other nutrients, I'll just close out here and look at some historic research here, just because we tend not to do this much anymore, but looking at the efficiency of placement, some of this work done where phosphorus being applied with the seed, 22 pounds per acre is equivalent to 45 pounds per acre if it was broadcast and incorporated. So we see that phosphorus placement advantage. And with potassium, we also see that a seed placement advantage compared to what could sometimes be up to 2 to 6 times more required if it's broadcast. Now, these applications are not necessarily meeting removal amounts, but those are things that need to be taken into when fertilizers are perhaps at a
I'm assuming John's battery died and he got kicked off. So I'm gonna say we're gonna let John or Dawn continue.